The courtroom smelled faintly of polished wood and quiet fear. 100 whispers filled the air like restless ghosts, echoing through marble walls that had seen decades of judgment. At the center of it all sat Raymond Hale, billionaire magnate, philanthropist in headlines, and, at this moment, the loneliest man in the world. His silver hair was disheveled, his tie loosened, his eyes red from sleepless nights. Across the aisle, cameras flashed behind glass. Reporters whispered into microphones, hungry for scandal. And just a few rows behind him, holding her breath and wringing her calloused hands, sat Clara Bennett, the maid who had once polished the marble floors of his mansion. She wasn't supposed to be there. She wasn't family, not even an employee anymore. She had no title, no reason, no standing in this kind of room. But she was there because no one else was. The trial had turned cruel. Raymond's own lawyer, a man with a $5,000 watch and no soul left to sell, had just stood up, muttered something about irreconcilable differences, and walked out. The courtroom gasped. The judge scowled. The billionaire sat in silence, humiliated, abandoned. And that was when Clara stood up. "Your Honor," she said, her voice trembling but clear, "if no one will defend him, I will." A silence heavier than thunder fell over the room. The judge peered over his glasses. "Excuse me?" Clara's throat tightened, but she didn't falter. "He doesn't deserve to be alone in this. I might not be a lawyer, but I've known this man since before anyone called him a billionaire. I know his heart and I know the truth." The courtroom erupted, laughter, murmurs, disbelief. A maid defending a billionaire? It was absurd. But Raymond lifted his head slowly, meeting her eyes for the first time in weeks. Behind the shame and fatigue there was something else. Recognition, maybe even hope. The judge sighed. "Miss Bennett. Clara Bennett. Miss Bennett, this is a court of law, not a charity. You cannot represent the defendant without credentials." "I'm not asking to," she said quietly. "I'm asking to speak for him, to remind this court who he really is." That sentence, quiet, defiant, hung in the air longer than anyone expected. The judge, perhaps out of pity, perhaps out of curiosity, allowed her to stay seated behind the defense table. The rest of the day blurred into legal jargon and accusations, but in the middle of it all, Clara sat beside Raymond like a small, unshaken anchor in a storm. When court adjourned, the billionaire didn't move. He stared at the polished surface of the table as reporters swarmed outside. Clara waited until the crowd thinned, then approached him. "Mr. Hale," she said softly. He looked up, his voice rough. "Why are you here?" "Because you looked like you needed someone who remembered you before the world did." For a long moment, he said nothing. Then with a quiet, broken chuckle, "You always were too stubborn for your own good, Clara." Clara Bennett had been working for the Hale family for 7 years. She was the kind of woman people overlooked, quiet, efficient, invisible in her pressed uniform and tied-back curls. But invisibility had its advantages. She saw things. She remembered details. She understood people not by what they said, but by how they moved when no one was watching. She'd been there the night Raymond's wife died, the night that broke the house in half. She'd been there when his son stopped speaking to him, when the laughter in the mansion turned to echoes, and when the world decided to turn its back on him, accusing him of fraud, deceit, corruption. She knew something didn't fit. The man she'd cleaned up after wasn't perfect, but he wasn't a monster. He was human, tired, grieving, and blind to how quickly wealth made you a target. So when she saw that same man sitting alone in court, she didn't see the billionaire everyone hated. She saw the widower who once carried coffee to the kitchen himself when she had the flu. That night, she returned to her small apartment on the east side of the city, peeling wallpaper, second-hand furniture, and a window that overlooked the parking lot of a gas station. She sat on her couch and opened her old laptop. She didn't know law, but she knew people, and people left trails and of words, of choices, of truth. She began searching news archives, financial statements, public records. At first, it was chaos. Numbers she didn't understand, phrases she couldn't pronounce. But Clara had the kind of mind that didn't let go once it found a thread. Somewhere between midnight and dawn, she found a name that appeared one too many times. Edward Klein, Raymond's former business partner, and the man testifying against him. She clicked deeper, eyes narrowing. Shell companies, offshore accounts, sudden transfers, all pointing back to Klein, not Hale. The next morning, Clara marched into Raymond's mansion. It was quiet now. Servants gone, curtains drawn, the weight of scandal heavy in the air. She found him in the study, sitting among unopened mail and dusty awards. "You shouldn't be here," he said without looking up. "Neither should you be in that courtroom alone," she replied. Dropping a folder onto the desk, he looked at it, frowning. "What's this?" "Your defense," she said simply. Raymond flipped through the papers, confusion deepening into disbelief. "Where did you find this?" "Public records. You can thank the internet and too much coffee." He stared at her. "Clara, this is evidence," she nodded. "Then use it." He sank back in his chair, a hand over his mouth. "You don't understand. The case isn't about truth anymore. It's about narrative. They've already decided I'm guilty." Clara crossed her arms. "Then we change the narrative." He looked up, a flicker of something returning to his tired eyes. "You talk like a lawyer." "No," she said with a small smile. "I talk like someone who still believes in you." The next few days were chaos. Raymond hired a new legal team, but none could match Clara's fire. She attended every meeting, asked questions that made even the attorneys uncomfortable, and brought them evidence no one had thought to look for. Slowly, the pieces began to shift. For the first time in months, Raymond began to stand straighter. The tremor in his hands lessened. He laughed once, a dry, unexpected sound, when Clara scolded him for skipping lunch. But outside, the press was merciless. Headlines painted him as a fallen angel, a greedy tycoon, a man who'd used everyone and paid the price. Cameras followed Clara too, snapping pictures of the mysterious maid who dared to speak up. The world wanted drama, not truth. Still, she didn't back down. "They can call me whatever they want," she told him one evening. "They don't know what it means to clean up someone else's mess for years and still see the good in them." He looked at her then, not as an employee but as something rarer, an equal. "You know," he said quietly, "I've had lawyers, investors, even politicians pretend to stand by me. But no one ever said they believed in me without asking for something in return." Clara smiled faintly. "I'm not asking for anything, Mr. Hale, just justice." He leaned back, thoughtful. "Then maybe justice still has a chance." When the second hearing arrived, the courtroom buzzed with anticipation. But this time Raymond Hale wasn't alone. Clara sat beside him again, not as a maid but as a symbol of stubborn loyalty. As the prosecution presented their case, she noticed something in the witness's tone, hesitation. Edward Klein's eyes darted away when asked about a transfer in the Cayman accounts. Clara scribbled a note, slid it to Raymond's lawyer. He read it, frowned, and asked the follow-up question she'd written. Klein faltered. The courtroom stirred, and in that moment, Raymond looked at Clara with something close to awe. The tide was turning, and slowly, but surely. That night, as rain began to fall softly outside the courthouse, Clara stood under the awning, clutching her coat. Raymond approached, umbrella in hand. "You should be at home resting," he said. "So should you," she replied. He hesitated, then offered her the umbrella. "You changed everything today." She shook her head. "No, Mr. Hale. You did that the moment you decided to fight again." They stood there in the rain, billionaire and maid, not as master and servant, but as two people bound by something stronger than circumstance, belief, and somewhere deep in the quiet of the city, a story that began with abandonment began to bloom into redemption. Morning sunlight broke over the courthouse like a reluctant promise. The news vans were already there, parked in tight rows, antennas raised like metal vultures ready to feed on the day's drama. Reporters in sharp coats rehearsed their lines while cameras flicked red with record. Inside, the corridors hummed with the sound of shoes, whispers, and speculation. Raymond Hale walked those corridors differently now. His step was slower, yes, but not broken. The shadows beneath his eyes were still there, but his gaze was steadier. He wasn't walking toward his execution anymore. He was walking toward a fight, and walking beside him was Clara Bennett, the maid who had no degree, no wealth, no power, just unshakable conviction. She held a notebook close to her chest, the one she'd filled with notes, highlighted pages, and scribbles that made more sense to her than to any trained lawyer. When they entered the courtroom, silence fell. Every eye turned to them, the billionaire and the maid side by side. Clara felt the weight of their judgment pressed down on her. She heard the whispers. Who does she think she is? Publicity stunt. Ridiculous, but she didn't look away. She'd spent her life being invisible. For once, she wasn't going to apologize for being seen. The trial resumed. The prosecution strutted with smug confidence. Their lead attorney, Sandra Cole, sleek and cold as steel, paced before the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, voice sharp enough to cut through glass, "the evidence is overwhelming. Mr. Hale diverted millions through shell companies under false charity accounts. His partner, Mr. Edward Klein, has already confessed to his involvement and to Mr. Hale's orchestration of the fraud." Raymond didn't flinch.
Clara did.
She'd seen the files. She knew that confession was fabricated under pressure. When the defense rose to cross-examine, Raymond's new lawyer, Tom Erickson, hesitated slightly, still unfamiliar with the nuances of the case. Clara leaned in, whispering something. Tom nodded and adjusted his question. "Mr. Klein," he began, turning to the witness. "You claim that Mr. Hale directed these transfers himself. Is that correct?" "Yes," Klein said, his voice thin. "Rehearsed. And yet," Tom continued, sliding a paper across the table, "this transaction," he pointed, "was initiated from an account registered under your name, not Mr. Hale's." Klein blinked. "That was oversight." Clara caught the tremor in his voice. "Oversight," she thought. "No, that's guilt," the lawyer pressed on. "This pattern repeats multiple times. Would you say all these are oversights too?" Klein's jaw clenched. "Mr. Hale approved them verbally. Do you have recordings, emails, or witnesses to prove that?" Silence. The courtroom leaned in. Sandra Cole frowned. The judge's pen froze mid-note. Clara glanced at Raymond, and for the first time in weeks she saw it, the faint spark of relief in his eyes. When the session adjourned for lunch, Raymond turned to her. "That question about the account, that was you." She smiled softly. "Someone had to ask it," he chuckled, quiet, genuine. "Clara Bennett, you might just outsmart half this courthouse," she shrugged. "I just pay attention."
Maid see more than people think. They ate lunch in the courthouse cafe. A strange kind of normal in the middle of chaos.
Raymond picked at a salad he didn't like, while Clara sipped black coffee from a paper cup. Around them, whispers continued, but she ignored them. "Tell me something," Raymond said finally. "Why didn't you leave?" "When this all started, when they dragged my name through the dirt, everyone else did." Clara thought for a moment. "Because leaving is easy when you only came for the paycheck. But I came for the people, and I don't believe in throwing people away when they stop shining." He looked at her, deeply moved. "You really think I'm innocent?" "I don't think," she said quietly. "I know." That afternoon, things took a darker turn. The prosecution brought in new evidence. Bank statements showing money funneled to an offshore account under a fake name, R. Hall, suspiciously close to Raymond Hale. Sandra Cole's smirk returned. "Mr. Hale, are you suggesting this mysterious R. Hall isn't you?" Raymond started to answer, but Clara whispered urgently to Tom. "Ask about the transaction date." Tom followed her cue. "Your Honor," he said, "may we draw attention to the date?" "March 17th. The day Mr. Hale was in Switzerland for his wife's medical treatment. Hospital records confirm this." Murmurs rippled through the room. The judge raised an eyebrow. Sandra's expression faltered. Tom continued, pressing the point. "So unless my client was in 2 countries at once, he could not have initiated this transfer." The jury whispered among themselves. Clara felt her pulse steady. Each fact she'd uncovered, each late-night reading through legal jargon was paying off. But then, a twist. The prosecution called their next witness, Maya Hales, Raymond's estranged son. Raymond froze. Clara's breath caught. The young man took the stand, jaw set, eyes hard. "Mr. Hales," Sandra began, "can you describe your father's character?" He hesitated. "He's complicated. Would you say he's honest?" Maya's son looked at his father, then away. "I don't know anymore." The words hit like a hammer. Raymond slumped slightly. Clara's hand brushed against his, a small, quiet gesture of strength. When the session ended, reporters swarmed. "Billionaire's own son doubts his innocence." The headline screamed before the ink was even dry. Back in the hallway, Raymond leaned against the wall, pale and defeated. "Maybe this is pointless," he murmured. "Even my son." Clara turned sharply. "Don't say that. He's hurt, not hateful. The world might doubt you, but that doesn't make them right." He met her eyes, tired, raw, searching. "You sound like my conscience." Then maybe you needed to hear it, she said softly. That night, the rain returned. Clara sat at her kitchen table, laptop open, frustration simmering beneath her calm. Every headline, every cruel comment online, but they twisted truth into spectacle. Maid turned savior became a meme. They mocked her accent, her clothes, her nerve. But Clara didn't back down. She kept searching, and at 2 a.m, she found it. A single email leaked in an old business archive. The sender, Edward Klein. The recipient, Maya Hales. Subject line: "We need to talk about the company's future." Attached was a document, a proposal to dissolve Hale Enterprises months before the fraud even surfaced. Klein had planned it. He'd set the trap. Her hands trembled. This was the proof, the missing link. She printed the email, tucked it carefully into a folder, and whispered to herself, "Tomorrow it ends." The next day, court resumed under heavy rain. Reporters stood under umbrellas, breath fogging the air as flashes of light bounced off wet pavement. Inside, Clara stood beside Raymond, folder in hand. Sandra Cole began her closing statements, voice smooth and venomous. Mr. Hale's defense has relied on sentiment, not evidence. Loyalty is touching, but loyalty cannot erase theft. Clara's knuckles tightened on the folder. When Tom rose to respond, she handed it to him. "Open it," she whispered. He did, and then froze. His eyes widened as he scanned the pages. "Your Honor," he said, interrupting, "new evidence has surfaced." The judge frowned. "Proceed." Tom stepped forward, holding up the printed email. This message, dated 4 months before the alleged fraud, clearly outlines Edward Klein's plan to dissolve the company and transfer funds, without Mr. Hale's knowledge or approval. The correspondence even shows Mr. Hales, the defendant's son, was misled into believing this was a legitimate restructuring. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Sandra Cole tried to object, but the judge raised his hand. Overruled. "This evidence stands." Raymond turned to Clara, eyes wide, almost unbelieving. She nodded slightly. Klein's face went white on the witness stand. That's fake," he stammered. Tom smiled thinly. "Then you won't mind if we verify it through the service provider, right?" Klein's silence was louder than thunder. Outside, the storm roared. Inside, something broke, not in despair but release. The truth had finally surfaced. As the gavel struck, the judge called a recess. Raymond exhaled, shoulders trembling with relief. Clara stood beside him, drenched in pride and exhaustion. He looked at her with quiet wonder. "You found it. You actually found it." She smiled, tears glinting in her eyes. "You said the truth didn't matter anymore." "I told you it does." He took a long breath. "Clara, I don't know how to repay you." "You don't have to," she said gently. "Just make sure you never forget what this felt like." He nodded slowly. "I won't." That evening, they left the courthouse together. Rain fell in silver sheets, washing the city clean. Cameras flashed. Microphones shouted questions, but neither of them stopped to answer. In the distance, thunder rolled, soft and fading, like applause from the heavens. The world had never loved a comeback story more than it loved a downfall. That was the first thing Clara learned in the weeks that followed. When the evidence broke and the truth began to unravel Edward Klein's lies, the media changed its tone overnight. Headlines that once screamed, "Billionaire scandal exposed," now read, "New evidence clears Raymond Hale of fraud allegations." The same anchors who had mocked Clara's courage now called her the voice of loyalty. The world was fickle, but justice, and at least this time, was patient enough to catch up. Inside the courtroom, the tension was almost unbearable on the morning of the verdict. Raymond sat in his usual seat, calm, collected, but his fingers tapped restlessly on the table. Clara sat beside him again, the small figure who had somehow managed to hold up an empire with nothing but her conviction. Judge Harmon adjusted his glasses, flipping through the thick stack of documents before him. In the matter of the state versus Raymond Hale, his voice carried the gravity of years of service. After review of all evidence, testimony, and new submissions, this court finds the defendant not guilty of all charges. The room erupted. Some gasped, some clapped, some muttered in disbelief. But Raymond didn't move, not at first. His eyes stayed fixed on the polished wood of the judge's bench, as if the words hadn't yet reached him. Then slowly, he turned toward Clara. She was already looking at him, eyes wet, smile trembling at the edges. "You did it," she whispered. He shook his head, his voice rough with emotion. No, Clara. We did it. The reporters outside had to be held back by security when the two of them walked out together. Microphones thrust forward like bayonets, questions flying like bullets. Mr. Hale, how does it feel to be cleared? Miss Bennett, do you plan to work for him again? Are you two? The rest was drowned by the storm. Rain fell again, poetic, persistent, as if the sky refused to let this story end dry. Clara pulled her coat tighter as Raymond opened an umbrella, holding it over both of them. The crowd roared behind the barricades, but in that small circle of shelter it was quiet. Just the sound of rain on fabric and the rhythm of relief. Do you regret standing up that day? Raymond asked softly. She shook her head. Not for a second. Even when the world laughed? They've laughed before, she said, smiling faintly. But I've learned something, Mr. Hale. When you stand for truth, laughter is just thunder before the light breaks through. For a time, the world didn't stop talking about them. Talk shows, interviews, endless articles. Everyone wanted the story of the maid who defended the billionaire. But Clara refused most of it. I didn't do it for fame, she told the few journalists she agreed to meet. I did it because right is right, no matter who's sitting on the other side of the table. Still, her face appeared on magazine covers. Social media called her the maid who mended justice. Universities sent invitations to speak. Even law schools quoted her words in seminars about moral courage. But she stayed in her small apartment for weeks, uneasy with the noise. Fame wasn't comfort. It was just another kind of attention. One evening, as she folded laundry in silence, there was a knock at her door. She opened it to find Raymond Hale standing there, dressed down for once. No suit, no entourage, just a tired man holding 2 coffee cups. You, don't answer your phone, he said lightly. I didn't think. Billionaires made house calls, she replied. Only when they owe someone their life. He stepped inside, setting the coffee down. You've been avoiding the world, he said. I've been catching my breath. He nodded slowly. You know, my PR team wanted to offer you a position. Public relations. 6-figure salary. Clara laughed softly. And you came to offer it yourself? He smiled. No, I came to offer something better. She raised an eyebrow.
What's that?
A partnership. 2 months later, the sign above the glass door of a refurbished downtown building read, Hale Foundation. For justice and integrity. Inside, the walls were painted a soft ivory, lined with photographs of people whose lives had been changed. Wrongly accused workers, single mothers fighting eviction, small business owners bankrupted by false claims. Clara walked through the halls, clipboard in hand, stopping to speak with volunteers and lawyers who now worked pro bono for those who couldn't afford defense. Raymond had given her full authority to run it. It's your idea, he'd said. You're the heart. I'm just the funding. Every time she walked past his office, she still couldn't quite believe it. The billionaire who once stood alone in court now spent his days signing checks to help people like her. The invisible. The overlooked. The unheard. Sometimes she'd catch him staring out the window, deep in thought, and she'd ask what he was thinking. How close I came to losing everything, he'd reply. And how strange it is that the person who saved me used to clean my floors. And now you let me run your foundation, she'd tease. He'd smile. Seems fair. You've been running my conscience for a while now. But not everyone celebrated their success. Some said the foundation was a PR move. Others accused Clara of manipulating him. Internet debates flared, fizzled, flared again. But this time she didn't flinch. One afternoon, a producer from NPR Charlotte called. We'd love to do a joint interview with you both, the woman said. Not about the case and about what comes after truth. Raymond left the choice to Clara. She agreed. If we're going to tell it, she said, we tell it right. NPR studio. The studio was small, intimate, warm lighting, quiet hum of equipment. Rain tapped faintly on the windows outside, as if the sky refused to stay away from their story. The interviewer smiled across the table. Clara Bennett, Raymond Hale, thank you both for joining us. Thank you for having us, Clara said. Your story has inspired millions, but I think what people want to know most is, why did you risk so much, Miss Bennett? Clara glanced at Raymond, then back at the interviewer. Because silence helps the wrong side, she said simply, and because sometimes the world needs reminding that integrity doesn't come with a title. The interviewer nodded, turning to Raymond. And you, Mr. Hale. How did it feel being defended by someone outside the legal world? Raymond smiled faintly. Liberating. Every lawyer I'd ever hired told me what I should say. Clara told me what I needed to hear. There was a pause, gentle, heavy. Do you two keep in touch beyond the foundation? The interviewer asked playfully. Clara laughed. Every day, she said. He still calls me when the coffee machine breaks. The room filled with warm laughter. But beneath it there was a stillness, a shared understanding of everything they'd survived. The interview ended with a single question. What have you both learned through all this? Clara leaned forward. That power doesn't always corrupt, she said. Sometimes it just reveals who you really are. Raymond added, and that salvation can come from the quietest corner of the room, the one everyone overlooks until it speaks. The recording light dimmed, and silence followed. When they stepped outside, the rain had stopped. The city smelled clean again, washed, renewed. They stood under the awning for a moment, neither speaking. The world had shifted so much in a year that words sometimes felt unnecessary. You ever miss the old days? Clara asked, half smiling. The days when you called me Mr. Hale and glared at me for leaving dishes in the sink? He teased. She laughed. Those exactly. He shook his head. No, I prefer this version of us, less hierarchy, more honesty. She looked up at the gray sky, thoughtful. Feels strange, doesn't it? Going from cleaning his floors to cleaning his reputation. Raymond grinned. You didn't just clean my reputation, Clara, you rebuilt it. Brick by brick. They began walking down the sidewalk, side by side, the billionaire and the maid, partners now in something far larger than either of them had imagined. As they passed the courthouse, Clara paused. The steps were slick from rain, gleaming under the streetlight. This is where it all began, she said quietly. Raymond nodded. Where you stood up when everyone else sat down, she smiled. And where you decided to fight again. They stood there for a moment, letting the memory breathe. Then Clara turned, her voice softer. You know, I still remember what you said after the verdict, that you didn't know how to repay me. He looked at her, a faint smile tugging at his lips. And I still don't. You already did, she said. You listened. For the first time in a long time, Raymond Hale laughed, freely, fully. It wasn't the polished laugh of a CEO or the polite chuckle of a public figure. It was something real, unguarded, grateful. As the two of them walked away from the courthouse, the city lights reflected in the puddles at their feet. The storm had ended, but its memory stayed, a reminder that some things have to break before they can shine. And somewhere, between the sound of their footsteps and the hum of distant traffic, their story, once written in scandal, had finally rewritten itself in light.